Good evening, everybody. My name is Stuart Croft. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University. And whether you're joining us here in the Shard tonight in person, you're also welcome, or online, we want to say a very warm welcome to you. And welcome to tonight's event, Warwick versus Pandemics. The name of our event is very appropriate, of course, as we reflect on the challenges presented by COVID to the world, as well as to a university like Warwick. And for those of you online, tonight is your chance to reconnect with Warwick, to hear how the university is starting our new academic year and to learn more about our contribution and future commitment to fighting global pandemics through research and education. We are very excited you're joining us for what is the first of many alumni and supporter events that we have planned. This evening, we'll be celebrating how world-leading research in our Institute for Global Pandemic Planning, our new Warwick initiative, is helping governments around the world plan for future pandemics. But before I pass over to our experts, I'd like to just highlight a few aspects of the recent achievements of our university. How Warwick has responded to the pandemic while maintaining our values of excellence with purpose in all that we do. I was incredibly proud of how our student and staff community rallied during the pandemic. Our medical school students volunteering in our hospitals, Warwick Manufacturing Group, 3D printing, PPE equipment, our scientists advising governments around the world. Approximately 1,000 students remained on campus during the first lockdown, and supporting them and their needs were the responsibilities of a dedicated team of Warwick staff to ensure these students still had access to all the key services. We as a university also reached out internationally during the pandemic, again colleagues in our medical school supporting medics in India to ensure that the right equipment, resources and support got to the right places at the right time. And we supplied enzymes for reagents to upscale testing in Africa and elsewhere in the world. A recent area of huge success for us has been the robust testing and vaccination program that we have on campus. We now estimate that 97% of our 29,000 students will be double vaccinated by the beginning of November. A huge step in making our campus as safe and welcoming as possible for everyone in our community and beyond. Now, as I hope that you are aware, our university has been recognised as the best university in the UK for teaching quality by the Good University Guide, published by the Sunday Times. Yes, please. The university's success in the 2021 National Student Survey and our response to the COVID-19 pandemic were the key reasons for our achievements in this year's awards, which included being runner-up in the University of the Year competition. And in the Sunday Times, we moved up to 8th. In the Guardian, we've progressed up to 6th place, while we maintained our top 10 UK position, top 80 position in the world in the Times Higher Education's World University Rankings for 2022. And our philanthropic achievements are keeping pace with our league table progression. Last week, we were able to announce a £3.5 million gift from a Warwick alum to astrophysics research. This is one of the largest philanthropic gifts to space research in the UK and will create 13 new PhD scholarships and 15 postdoctoral fellowships, a major advance in our research capacity in this area. Warwick will be at the leading edge of new discoveries about our universe. We'll be sharing more news on the generosity and friendship of our alumni in the next few weeks, but I hope for now we can all be incredibly proud of these achievements. Despite the enormous challenges of the pandemic, we were able to welcome the classes of 2020 and 2021 to our Warwick Global Alumni community, which is now more than 250,000 strong. The fact that we have alumni from 182 countries reflects our truly international influence and outlook. Warwick is a place of possibility, a place that pushes boundaries, a place where we make a difference to society through our groundbreaking research and our world-class graduates. You, our worldwide community of alumni and friends, are making a vital impact through your support, your advocacy, and your philanthropy. All of our alumni have a crucial role to play in supporting opportunities for our students, whether that's sharing in your networks, providing valuable career support, or helping us to bring the best talent to Warwick by sharing stories of the difference our university has made to your lives. More than 5,000 of you have stayed connected with Warwick through attending our webinars. And thank you to our supporters who gave more than £3 million in just a few months to support both pandemic research and the students themselves who had been so negatively affected by the impact of COVID. I am delighted that two of our biggest supporters of pandemic research, our pandemic response, are able to join us tonight. Through philanthropy, you've already achieved so much. From advancing research to address global challenges, to breaking down barriers to education by supporting students from all backgrounds at all stages of their education. But there is still so much more that we can achieve together. Warwick has a vision for excellence, and through partnerships with our alumni, we can and will improve the lives of people around the world. As we emerge from the pandemic, we're focusing on an exciting range of new projects, including an ambitious science, technology, engineering and mathematics grand challenge to deliver large-scale investment into our £500 million planned new science campus to transform the way science is delivered at Warwick. By introducing a new research training pathway for sustainability at Warwick, we are testing the real-life implications of creating a sustainable future and tackling the practical challenges of getting there for every member of society. And, of course, our Institute for Global Pandemic Planning. Established in April 2020, it combines world-class expertise in epidemiology, public health, and behavioural science to develop comprehensive solutions for global leaders struggling to respond to the health, social, economic, and psychological impacts of pandemics. The Institute is establishing a robust pipeline of 30 doctoral students to expand worldwide scientific leadership on managing pandemics and to research the best ways for global leaders to respond. We are very excited that the first 6 scholars are now in post. The experience of COVID-19 demonstrates governments everywhere need access to interdisciplinary expertise, particularly from epidemiology, public health, and behavioural science, all disciplines in which Warwick has great and deep expertise. Now, it's time to meet the experts and welcome our special guest for the evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our panellists, starting with Warwick alum Lord Gus O'Donnell, an economist, former Cabinet Secretary under Prime Ministers Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and David Cameron. Lord O'Donnell studied economics at Warwick in the 1970s and is now a life peer in the House of Lords, where he sits as a crossbencher. He does a lot more besides. Professor Mike Tilsley, an infectious disease modeller and member of the UK government's Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Modelling, SPI-M, if you are an aficionado. He has also done so much in broadcast media for the public understanding of the pandemic over the last couple of years in particular. Dr. Nicole Robb, a virologist who is working to understand the basic biology of RNA viruses like COVID-19, leading to new ways to diagnose and combat viral disease. Her lab is based in our stunning new interdisciplinary biomedical research building, which the Wolfson Foundation helped to make possible. And Professor Nick Chater, behavioural scientist on the UK government's Climate Change Committee, who's written a paper on what can be learned from the behavioural response to the COVID-19 crisis. Nick is joining us online tonight. So now, it's over to our panellists and our audience to look at pandemic planning in greater depth. Mike.
So thank you very much, and thank you, Stuart, for that very kind introduction. So tonight we're going to talk about the Institute for Global Pandemic Planning, what the purpose is, how a range of interdisciplinary expertise will help to drive the research that's going to be carried out by the Centre over the next several years. But before we do this, what we would like to do is put you in the room and also joining us online in the role of policymakers. And so what we're going to do is we're going to present a little scenario, and what we would like to do is you to think about what you would do given the scenario, and then we're going to talk a little bit about our expertise and how that might influence decision making. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to imagine that the year is 2031 and a new virus has been identified in a country somewhere in the world. And I know, having just, getting to the stage we might be starting to emerge from this pandemic, thinking about another one in 10 years' time is a little bit horrifying. But of course it is something that we need to think about in pandemic planning. So we know that this virus is emerging, and there's potentially a pandemic on the horizon. So you are a member of government in a nation of 60 million people. This is some unidentified government somewhere in the world. Now, what I would like you to do, based upon this information we've given you, is vote and tell me, what would you do? Would you wait and see how the situation develops? That is answer A. And I will tell you, for those that don't know how, I'll tell you how to vote in a minute. Would you gather data and supplies, or would you immediately introduce social distancing measures? So you can vote with your phones if you have them. If you are unable to get a signal, you can join the Warwick guest Wi-Fi, which you should be able to access directly from your phones. So there's a QR code there on the screen that you should be able to access, or you can go to the website slido.com and put in the hashtag WVP21. So I'm just going to give people just a couple of minutes just to pick an option, and then we're going to see the results. Now, try not to be influenced by what is becoming most popular as this goes on. This is not groupthink. Okay, we've still got a few people in the room voting. Of course, if you're joining us online, you should also be able to vote, so please do if you can. I'm just going to wait for the last couple of people who are in the room who look like they're still trying to vote. This seems to be sort of settling into some kind of equilibrium. Okay. Well, in the interest of time, I will move on from this. So what we're seeing here, and, given the sparse information I've given you, probably I would argue the majority have gone for what I would say is probably the right decision in this situation, which is gather data and supplies. There is no right or wrong answer, but that's personally what I would go for. Now, arguably, though, we've been a little bit unfair, because what we have asked you to do is make a decision based upon very, very sparse data. So I'm going to give you some more details now, and in a minute, we're going to get you to vote again. So now, what you know is that there have been 1,500 deaths in one country somewhere in the world. Since the first cases were reported 2 months ago. What you also know is that this virus is easily transmittable from humans to humans, so this is a bit of a concern. In your own country, hospital ventilators are in short supply, and so I say, please, sorry, don't vote now on this. We're going to get you to vote again in a minute, so please don't vote until we tell you. Hospital ventilators are in short supply, and a handful of travel-related cases in the country you govern have been reported. And again, please don't vote yet, because before we get you to vote, we're going to go to our panellists and we're going to give you a little bit of information from our own perspective that may hopefully help you to inform your decisions. So I guess without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Nicole Robb, who's going to talk to you about the public health perspective.
Thank you, Mike, and good evening, everybody. Hello, nice to see you here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that we need to gather in a pandemic scenario. So pandemics are caused when a novel virus gets into the human population and we've got no immunity to it. When that happens, there's an urgent race against time. We need to get a sample into the lab and we need to identify exactly what that novel virus is. We can do that by looking at a sample under a microscope or by studying the genetic material inside the virus. And once we've identified that novel virus, that then kicks off a whole host of other experiments. So we need to determine how the virus is transmitted. We need to test whether any existing antivirals that we have may be effective against it. And we also need to identify the antigenic part of the virus. So this is the part of the virus that our immune system recognizes. And that's what you need to know when you start thinking about vaccine design. At the same time, we also need epidemiological studies. So these are really important. They're going to tell you where that novel virus came from. You're going to assess the clinical impact of the virus, determine who gets the disease, if some people are more susceptible than others, for example. And we need to design and implement a whole host of public health measures to try and stop the transmission of the virus. So this includes mask wearing, social distancing that we're all very familiar with today. So one of the most important tools at our disposal that we need to carry out these studies is having really good viral diagnostics and surveillance measures. This is something that my laboratory works on. So a couple of examples of what we do during COVID. We have worked with others to develop safe protocols to handle the virus in the lab. So normally when you're working with such a dangerous pathogen, you'd want to be in a very high containment laboratory where you have really stringent measures in place to stop yourself or others getting infected. We've come up with a way that you can very quickly and easily inactivate the virus so it can be safely handled in just standard laboratory conditions, something that's really important in places of the world where high containment lab facilities aren't very common. We've also validated and tested a completely new diagnostic technology. This is something that's based on microscopy and artificial intelligence. Gives you a result in just a minute, so that's quite a lot quicker than any of the existing things that we've got at the moment, and we're really hoping that that gets implemented soon. So my final words are just about sort of how important speed is when you think about gathering all of this data. So when a new disease outbreak occurs, you need to find out all of these things as fast as possible. And one thing that we've learned from COVID is how important global cooperation is in that, and also how important it is to already have plans and policy in place, as well as train people that can just be mobilized really fast to the site in order to stop that outbreak as soon as possible. So being part of the IGPP is really exciting because obviously this is an initiative that's really bringing that to reality. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Nick Chater, who's up on the screen there. He's going to give us some of his insights into behavioral science and how that affects disease control.
Well, thank you so much, Nicole, and good evening, everyone. I want to throw in two insights from behavioral science, which I think are very relevant to understanding how to handle pandemics. I don't give you all the answers, but at least there's considerations worth bearing in mind. The first one concerns the process of decision-making itself. So the Princeton psychologist Phil Johnson-Laird has claims that and I think rather correctly, that the one big error, the biggest error we make in decision-making is what he calls one model thinking. So the way that plays out is, I assess a complex and ambiguous situation. I think, what's the right model of this? What's going on? And then I make a decision based on that model. The trouble with this strategy is that often, and this is very true in pandemics, we don't really know what the right model is. So if we have the wrong model in mind, we're going to make the wrong decision. And a better strategy is going to be to consider decision-making which is going to be robust to many models. Let me give you two examples from the last pandemic, or the pandemic we're still in. One model in the early stages, intuitively for decision makers, is this is inevitable. It's like the tide's coming in. We can't stop it. We just need to manage it as well as possible. So locking down early is hopeless, and therefore we just need to make sure that the curve is flattened as much as possible. So if you're trying to stop the inevitable, that's a pointless activity. You've just got to let it happen in the smoothest and least damaging way possible. That's one model. Another model is that this is like a fire in my house, and I've got to put it out as quickly as possible. And leaving it a long time is going to be really bad. And the quicker I act, and the more drastically I act, the better. It's really not obvious which model is the right model, but most decision makers will tend to jump to one perspective or the other. And what we really need to do, particularly when information is sparse, is to think about behaviors which are going to be robust to either possibility, and indeed, of course, other possibilities. The second point is about not decision makers, but about us as citizens. Now, we've seen that we've actually had remarkable solidarity in changing our behavior in truly dramatic and drastic ways. And I think that's been possible because of the human collective ability to do what psychologists call we thinking. So rather than thinking, what's good for me, what should I do, we're thinking, what's good for us, what should we do as a society? And we're able to play our part and also help other people play their part in a really remarkably pro-social way. But to do that, we all need to feel we understand what the problem is, we understand what the uncertainties are, and we're not being in any way misled or given information that we don't fully trust. So complete transparency, as far as is possible, between decision makers and politicians and the public is absolutely crucial. and an emphasis on the fact that we are all in this together. It's a phrase we've heard a lot. That's really crucial from a behavioral science point of view. We're going to be good at tackling problems of collective good if we tackle our collective, if we engage our collective will. With that, I'm going to hand over to Mike Tilsley, who's going to talk about the perspective from epidemiological modelling.
So thanks very much, Nick. So we've had really great summaries there of the impact of public health and behavioural science upon infectious disease spread and control. So I, as Stuart said in the introduction, so I'm an infectious disease modeller, so I've been involved for the last, 18 months now as part of SPI-M, which sounds like a sort of a shady government organisation, but really our role has been very much to kind of inform government regarding how a disease might spread and the potential impact of interventions. Now, there might be, I'm sure, people in the room tonight and online that think models can answer everything, and indeed there will be people here who think that models can answer nothing. But what I will say, the key thing for me is models are only as good as the data that go in them. And that's the really, really important thing that we need to say. And actually, in the very early stages of an emerging outbreak, the models can tell you very little. It's actually really important that you have what I would call on-the-ground muddy boots epidemiology. People going out into the field, finding cases, determining how much a virus spreads, and how people might react to that spread. So this is where, of course, expertise such as those from Nicole and from Nick really, really come in to help inform the models. Now, of course, once we have these data, these models can be used to answer some questions in the early stages. Now, about 2 years ago, I would give lectures to my undergraduates and I would talk to them about the R number, and I would have to explain in fine detail what the R number was. And I suspect this is something I will never, ever have to do again, because I suspect probably everyone in the audience could tell me what the R number is. But actually, this is really important. In the early stages of an epidemic, we need to know what the R number is. You need to know if it's greater than 1, that means that you are likely to have an epidemic that will be out of control without some measures. If it's less than 1, then of course the indication is the disease is probably going to die out. So in the early stages, that is a really key indicator that these models can tell us. But of course, we need the data that goes into them. The other aspect of this, of course, is as more data are accrued, we need to refit the models. And of course, our forecasts and our projections get that much more robust as we collect more data. In the longer term, of course, these models can be used to forecast how a disease may spread and the impact of intervention strategies. And this, of course, is what we've been doing, say, for 18 months plus now in terms of trying to inform government decision-making. But there's one key thing here that I need to mention. Throughout all of this, it's really, really important to communicate uncertainty. And I think it's something that maybe has not been done brilliantly in the media throughout this pandemic. I'll give a simple example of this. If I were to tell you, if you were going out for a day trip tomorrow and I were to tell you there's a 10% chance of rain, you may decide you're not going to take an umbrella. If I told you there was a 90% chance of rain, then of course that would influence what you do. Now, of course, we're very comfortable with the idea of uncertainty when it comes to the weather, but actually there is still a lot of uncertainty when it comes to disease spread. And it's really important for us to recognise these models don't give us definite answers. By collecting data, as I said, we can ensure that that uncertainty reduces, and of course these models get more robust over time, but collaboration between different experts is really, really key to trying to resolve that model uncertainty and then communicate it appropriately. So I guess in conclusion with this, interdisciplinary research is vital. We modelers throughout the pandemic have worked really closely with public health experts and behavioural scientists and indeed policymakers to improve these model forecasts and provide policy recommendations. Now, of course, we are only scientists, we are not decision makers, and that is really, really important. And so I guess who better to talk about the policy side than Lord O'Donnell? So he's going to give us his perspective now of the kinds of things that decision makers have to think about when they look at all of this scientific advice.
Thank you. And the one thing I'd say, first of all, is it's great to have experts here who haven't disagreed with each other. Now, that's a big start if you're in government. And the second thing is, of course, you're right to emphasise the uncertainty. That's one of the things that, you all want to go to. You've all learned the lessons of the last war, I'd say. You all want to be in there. You want to do stuff. And it's interesting to know how many times you would want to do stuff and it turned out to be the wrong thing. So the politicians will have that in their mind because for them, there's always trade-offs in these things. That's a word we haven't heard yet, right? So they'll be thinking about benefits and costs of this. Lockdown, that's completely unnecessary, that ex post turns out to be unnecessary, but ex ante might have been very sensible, is politically very costly and could be economically very costly. Could cost the Prime Minister their job if they did it. And it turned out afterwards, with hindsight, as we're getting from select committee reports now, with hindsight, it looks like that was the right decision. And if it turns out that with hindsight they shouldn't have done anything, but they did, then they'll suffer. And that, for them, politically, is important. So they need to know, they need to get some information about that. Secondly, they need to understand, as you say, they want data. They want answers. I remember there's that classic thing that Lyndon Johnson was supposed to say when he asked his economists for, what's the impact on my revenue of cutting taxes? And they said, it's a range of like 10 billion to 30 billion. And he said, ranges are for cattle. I want an estimate, right? And politicians want a number. And it's like when you talk about a number for R, I always scream at the television saying, well, what's the confidence interval on 1? Is it 0.3 to 1.7, or is it, quite small? And obviously, as we get more data, those confidence intervals will come down, as long as the data are collected sensibly. One of the things that I'm passionate about, and I hope in your the centre, you'll have some statisticians, because we had some, I suppose the technical word is crap data very early on, because we weren't using ONS. And when ONS started doing random sampling and all the rest of it, suddenly we get somewhere. Suddenly we understand some things about people with asymptomatic symptoms who hadn't asked for a test, because why should they? But ONS was random sampling, so we start to pick up something. So the statisticians are vital, right? Everyone thinks of pandemics as medical, and of course, that's massive. And in the end, you are in some ways the most important, because if we can't get a vaccine and we can't work out what the treatments are, we are lost, basically. But along the way, lots and lots of other disciplines, hence the interdisciplinary nature, are very important. So you need to understand, so get the statos working, get the data up, understand, as you were, start filling in the models, start seeing, as Nick said, what are robust strategies, whatever the model is. Does a lockdown work irrespective? And there might be some costs foregone, but they might be worth it. But in all of these things, you are asking some quite difficult stuff of politicians, right? Because to actually do that cost-benefit stuff is really hard. And it's in the reason it's really hard, it's in the language politicians hate to use. Because your model answers are going to give us strategy 1, do nothing. Strategy 2, do a bit. Strategy 3, do quite a lot. And those will have associated with them various death numbers. Let's be honest. But they'll also have some economic and social costs. In full lockdown, we might be closing down schools. We might be not allowing anyone to visit anyone. There's all sorts of social costs that might have long-term consequences. We might be doing things which actually are damaging in terms of our ability to manage other diseases. There are all sorts of costs that might be there, and we need to estimate them all up. The only way you can start doing these things is when you start, dare I say it, talking about values of life and values of, I would say the most sophisticated way of doing this is wellbeing years, which are kind of something I haven't got time to go into now. But there are sophisticated ways to add these things up together, but they do depend on massive assumptions and massive value judgments, which politicians want to hide. They absolutely don't want to go anywhere near this sort of language or have this discussion about trade-offs. That just doesn't work. And as a former press secretary, I'd be like, we're not going there. We're absolutely not going there. We're going to explain to people why this is a really, really good idea, whatever the idea turns out to be. So it is complicated. What you've got here as well is a lot of experts coming to sort of advice, and then we'll mingle all of their medical advice with social, behavioural, economic advice, and we'll put that to someone who is obviously incredibly well trained in decision making under uncertainty, right? They understand risk, they understand statistics. No. They understand how to get elected, right? They are politicians, they're elected politicians. You cannot expect them to grasp all of this. So you have to think about ways you can get it across. And then there's a question of informing the decision maker, and then there's the secondary question. Once you've made your decision, is how do you communicate that with the public? And then I'd be talking to Nick and saying, okay, Nick, I'll be talking, as you said, about your examples about risks and all the rest of it. How do we get the public to understand what we want them to do and why they should do it? And that requires trust. I think probably the biggest problem we'll have with this pandemic in 2031, which is very interesting, 60 million people. I was thinking, Christ, they really have tightened up on immigration, because current UK population is 67, but then I realised this is Warwick. You are very, very smart. So I figured it out and thought, okay, so at current trends, what's the population that will be 60 million? England. So not only has Scotland and Northern Ireland voted for independence, but Wales has gone with them. So pretty dramatic. But, I think all of this suggests just this is difficult. This is not easy, but there is a great tendency to fight the last war. So if there hasn't been another virus between now and 2021 and 2031, what you'll find is, just as we had in government, which I helped put together, very good plans for a flu pandemic, we'll have very good plans for this. But 2031 may not be this. It may be something rather different, and the experts will be able to tell us how likely that is. But I just live in fear of something which has got the transmittability of this, but with the fatality of some other viruses, then we are in deep doo-doo, to use the technical term. Let's stop with that.
Well, thank you so much for your insights, Lord O'Donnell. Right, we're going to put the floor back to the floor, and we're going to ask you to vote again now. So hopefully Nick is going to disappear, and you'll see our Slido screen. Right, please vote now. Just a reminder of how to do that. You can use the QR code or type slido.com into your web browser. And this is to everyone in the room and everyone joining us online as well. Have what we've said influence your decisions at all?
Looks like you've scared them.
That's quite a dramatic change.
Okay, well, just give it a few more seconds just to kind of level off a little bit, but it does look like we are getting a bit of a swing on this one. Interestingly, no one is going for wait and see now.
Groupthink.
We're glad that we do see a change. We're a bit worried if it stayed the same.
Okay, so I think we'll move on, because I think that's sort of saturated. And we have seen, actually, with more information, last time most people voted for gathering data. This time there has been a shift because of the severity of the virus. More people are going for now some kind of social distancing measures introduced. Notice we kept that deliberately vague, because we're not necessarily advocating in this scenario you would go into total lockdown, but you might put some measures in place to keep things under control. Now, we're going to have one final scenario here, and we're just going to slightly change it up a little bit, and I'm going to have one final vote, and then we're going to wrap this part of this session up. So now, let's forget about what I've just told you about this virus, and let's say that it actually, what we have is we have a virus where you have reported 30 deaths in Southeast Asia. The virus is found in birds, and all the deaths reported so far have been linked to people who work in the poultry industry or who work at live bird markets. And you have evidence that would suggest that it cannot be easily transmitted from human to human. However, of course, due to infected poultry, food security is an issue. So again, sorry, final vote of the night, but could you please now, given this information, vote again on what you would do given this information? never quite know how these things are going to turn out when people vote, but it's heartening to see that we are getting a shift between the different scenarios. Okay, so it looks like what we're getting is a bit of a reset back to the original vote from this one. Though more people actually are going for wait and see in this scenario. Okay, so I think that's settled down. I mean, so the point I wanted to make here is that the decision that you make as government decision makers in the room of the unnamed country that we talked about earlier of 60 million people, it depends on exactly what the characteristics of the virus are. Now, of course, I'm sure most of you will have recognised that the first scenario that we presented was very similar to the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, whereas this scenario is probably more similar to emergence of H5N1, avian influenza in Southeast Asia back in kind of 2004-05. Now, in that scenario, the second one, because we weren't seeing a situation where you were getting spread from human to human, then probably what you might want to do is control it within the poultry industry, go around, do targeted surveillance, try to identify how it might be spreading, and if necessary, cull infected birds. But you don't potentially want to introduce controls at the human level. Now, Lord O'Donnell actually has done a fantastic job in his wrap-up, because I was going to talk actually about exactly what you've given a great summary of, which is the other harms associated with a pandemic. And it's really important. It is actually something that we've been thinking about a lot. So in my role on SPI-M, one of the things I've been working a lot on is education and trying to look at spread in schools, but also thinking about impacts of school closures, because as you quite rightly said, Lord O'Donnell, control measures are not free. You know, you will, if you only care about health, then of course you're always going to recommend very severe controls because you only care about health. But of course, there is a negative impact. If schools are closed for several months, there are not only short-term educational harms, but potentially long-term educational harms for some children because of being out, having no access to education for that period of time. And of course, you might have to make that decision if you're in a scenario where the NHS in the UK is going to be overwhelmed. It might be that that's a necessary action you have to take. But of course, you do need to think about long-term costs. And actually, it's one of the things that we are working on, some of us in the Institute are thinking very carefully about, is trying to determine what an optimal policy might be where we take into account all of these harms. Now, of course, that's extremely complex and, of course, exactly where you need interdisciplinary research to try to establish. You were mentioning, Lord O'Donnell, about the costs associated with, say, quality-adjusted life years, as we call them. So how many life years you might gain by a certain pharmaceutical intervention and trying to determine whether it's cost-effective to do that. Now, it is a very sensitive subject, of course, but it is something that we do need to think about, that we can't claim that lockdown is free. There are long-term impacts of that, and it's something that when we're planning for the next pandemic and we have time to think about what scenarios we might want to advise the government to do, thinking about not just the short-term impacts on the pandemic, but the long-term costs is something that's extremely important. And of course, we can only do this in the Institute with the huge range of interdisciplinary expertise that we are very fortunate to have access to. So that really wraps up what we wanted to say for this section of this event. But I would like to pass back to my colleague Nick, who is going to wrap this up for us. And
so
I think
thanks.
we're going to move back to Stuart.
Thank you very much, Mike. So I just want to point out really that the sort of, you might think it's a rather artificial exercise to have to make such big decisions with so little information. But of course, that's exactly the situation that government decision makers have been in the last 18 months. And one of the things that makes the Institute for Global Pandemic Planning so crucial is that although the data may be sparse and we have to work with the data that we've got as it comes in, what we don't want to be having to do is at the same time as getting the data, figuring out what our criteria are, what our possible plans are, what our possible actions are. So what we need to do in the next few years, the next decade and beyond, as a world, is we need to be thinking carefully about what we need to know, what possible plans we have in place, how to measure the value and the detriments of various actions we can take, so that as the data comes in, as a potential pandemic develops, we can have a clear set of strategies and plans to put in place. And without that, we're simply working on the fly by the seat of our pants, as we have been in the last 18 months. And that's clearly a very difficult way to work. So we need to do much better next time. We can do that by having really, really careful, thoughtful, and highly interdisciplinary planning. Of course, to do that, we're going to have to bring together a lot of expertise. We're going to have to also work very closely, not just across disciplines, but with people who have active experience of policy making. We need to make this both academically rich and deep, but it also really needs to connect with real processes of government and expertise in policy making, so that it's actually relevant to the decisions that people are actually having to make. One thing we want to do with IGPP is to build up the deep academic expertise to underpin these questions and, of course, the policymaking connections. But alongside that, we want to build up the possibility of rapidly mobilizing expertise so that when a crisis does emerge, both in Warwick and elsewhere, we have the capacity to bring together really high-quality teams of people who can be immediately mobilized to address these problems. And I think that's something that we have actually done remarkably well. Warwick's been very involved, and Mike indeed has been extremely closely involved with being part of that mobilization. But we've had to do it in a rather ad hoc way. We need to have something much more systematic and much more large scale when there's a next time, and I fear there will be. So I think we want to be at the forefront of leading the process of dealing with pandemics better, not just for the UK, of course, but globally. And with that, I'm going to hand back to our Vice Chancellor, Professor Stuart Croft, for questions from the audience.
Great, Nick, thanks very much. We did ask our online audience for some questions, and I've got a few that I want to ask in a moment. But just before I do, Gus, do you want to do any kind of final reflections on what you've heard? Because I've seen you writing quite a lot of notes.
Just one point about data, and I mean, it's really important to create data, not just to sit there and think, what can we make, but think about what the questions you really want answers to, and then go out there and get it. Like, don't be passive in this. And the second thing is, a lot of people, I'm sure this is going to happen after this pandemic, and we've got all these select committees, eventually we'll have an inquiry, and we will be very, very good at building up our stocks of pandemics. Everyone will listen to us. We'll do what Nick says, and we'll, and then time will march on. And eventually we'll decide it's a bit of a waste of time having all of this stuff. And if you think I'm joking, look at California. Schwarzenegger did create very large numbers, pop-up hospitals, ventilators, all sorts of stuff. Change of governor, all used up. So it's not just about having good planning. It's about having some way to make sure it lasts. And we as humans, as Nick will tell you, have relatively short memories in certain respects, and we'll forget. And when you're running the health service at roughly 100%, high capacity, and there's all that stuff lying around, not being used, wasted, they'll say. Great temptation is to say, okay, well, we'll spend another 10 million on drugs, and we won't buy any more PPE because we've got that stuff and we'll use that up. Once you do that, you're back where you started. So those are the only things I'd add.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just want to pick up a few questions that have come in. Colleagues, you have 2 minutes to answer each question. 2 minutes. Nick, you're first. 2 minutes, Nick, on this question from Stephen, which says, what role does interdisciplinarity across the arts, sciences and social sciences have to play in new discoveries to combat pandemics?
Yeah, I think the interdisciplinarity is absolutely crucial to everything we do. So we're actually setting up IGPP so that everybody is working across disciplines by default. So all our new PhD students, for example, are automatically supervised by people in 2 of the disciplines of epidemiological modelling, behavioural science or public health. Also, that's true at the level of faculty. We're all interdisciplinary, we have to be, and we have to be working together. Just to highlight one area, one discipline we haven't talked about, which came up in Gus's comments on our short memories, which is history. In fact, looking at the history of past pandemics and actually past disasters and crises of all kinds is an incredibly rich source of understanding about what's going to happen in the future. So we have to embed our thinking, not just in our understanding of the current moment, but a historical understanding. We could also think about the presentations of pandemics and indeed disease more generally in literature, and the arts, and how that shapes our expectations, our understanding, and our attitudes towards them. So from the broadest sources, from the hard sciences, from biology, from mathematics, from psychology, throughout the arts, we need to be harnessing expertise across the entire university, but not, of course, just from university. We want IGPP to be something which is connecting. It's a centre of a network across the globe. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. Thanks very much. Mike, this one's going to be for you. So Judith asks, how should governments balance the wish to protect their own citizens through acquisition of vaccines against the need to provide poorer countries with adequate supplies?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I'm actually going to I will answer that question, but I'm going to answer something else a little bit different first, which is actually vaccination within the country, because I think that's also quite important. We have a very highly successful vaccination campaign in the UK. However, there is a disparity. There are certain communities where vaccine access has been not quite so good, and there is a danger in the longer term that we could actually have persistence of the virus in certain parts of the country. So I think it's important not just to look at internationally, but also looking at access to vaccination throughout our own country, and I think that's a real concern. On the international question, it is actually important, and in a way, actually, it's in our own interests. If we're sending vaccinations overseas, assisting countries, lower and middle-income countries that don't have the access to vaccines, it will in the long term help the UK in terms of reducing the risks of variants of concern coming in that might evade our own vaccination programmes. So it is something that wealthier countries need to do more. Some of it is happening, but you would argue not enough to try to send out extra vaccines to those countries around the world where vaccine uptake is still incredibly low. You know, there's many countries in Africa where vaccine access is in the few percent at the moment, and it clearly needs seriously addressing in the not too distant future.
Okay, thanks very much. Nicole, you're next. A question from Lex. What was the most surprising thing about the COVID-19 pandemic, and what was the most predictable?
So I guess I think about this from a virology point of view. So the second part, what was predictable, I'd say absolutely nothing. But the first part, the most surprising, I think for me, one of the surprising and probably frightening things was how this virus is transmitted. So you mentioned the asymptomatic transmission. So that means that people can get sick, that people can get infected and spread the virus before getting sick or even having any symptoms at all. So that was something that we didn't know before this pandemic broke out, and that we now do. And linked to that is also the fact that this virus can be transmitted through the air so easily. So we now know that the virus survives in much, much smaller respiratory droplets than previously thought. So it can actually hang around in the air. It can even be moved by air currents from room to room long after the people have left. So all of that makes the transmission of this particular virus particularly tricky to deal with. It obviously has a massive effect on the R number because more people get infected. And it makes public health measures to stop transmission much more difficult. So I think that was the most surprising thing for me.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you very much. Everyone's been really good in staying in 2 minutes. Gus, you don't have to stay with the 2 minutes. How could I possibly impose that upon you? The question that you've got, I'm going to give you this one from Declan. Based on the wide-ranging and varied responses to COVID-19 pandemic across the world, do you envisage that we can develop an optimum and more speedily effective global approach to any future such events?
It's a really interesting question in the sense of when I looked at this, and you compare this crisis, say, to the global financial crisis, and you look at the international architecture, right? And we've got the IMF and the World Bank and things like that at the international level, quite respected institutions. And in the health area, we've got the WHO. WHO is under severe pressure, the Americans ceasing to fund it. Lots of issues about whether they were really genuinely looking into the source of the virus. So I think what you need for this to work is strong, trusted international institutions. And that's really important. And I think we therefore need to think about how do we rebuild the WHO as a strong, trusted institution. That would be my big thing. The sharing among scientists was very good, I think. I talked to Eliza Manningham-Buller, head of Wellcome, very, very early on that the Chinese had shared various sequencing information much earlier than last time, which was much better. So I hope that will carry on. And it's intriguing that she talked to me about the people doing the vaccines, and she mentioned the US, the UK, and Australia. And I'm kind of really interested as to what happened to the Australian bit. Maybe they did come up with good stuff. I don't know. But I think that international idea of how do people best do these different things? Because also, I hope that there'll be lots of PhDs on lessons to learn from, because talk about a global experiment. I mean, you've got on the one hand the Australia-New Zealand model, you've got the Singapore model, you've got the UK model, and there are all sorts of different ones around. You've got different states in the US doing different things. There must be some good analysis that can be done as to what works and what doesn't. And in particular, when we throw out these things about social distancing or lockdown or the rest of it, to be honest, we really need something better to know what are the things that really work. You know, because we're all told to wash our hands and do all the ancillary stuff. Was that a good idea or not? Did that matter? And so it will be good to know what are the lessons we've got from this, not just about the kind of the vaccines and all the rest of it, but those measures which you take, which have big impacts on social and economic and mental health and stuff like that. What's the benefits of them? Which are the ones that really make a difference? Is it stopping people going in closed spaces in stadiums, for example? We were talking about that versus schools. That's, I think, the sort of knowledge we need for next time. And internationally, because everyone's done such different things, because we haven't got a strong view. Global financial crisis, we did know that the thing to avoid at all costs was protectionism, right? And we had to try and keep things going. And that banks were basically a con job, which was really important not to let that go out there, and therefore we needed not to let there be a run on the bank. Therefore, governments needed to semi-nationalise banks, which we did with RBS and others. And people did around the world. So there were things that you kind of thought about in theory, which you actually did in practice. And we need to learn all those lessons so we're ready next time.
Great, thanks very much. Can I see if there's anybody in here, in the audience in the show, I'd like to ask a question? Please. There's going to be a microphone come for you.
Just to continue with what God said, what I have observed is the rich have become richer and the poor have become poorer, and that gap is never going to come closer. It's only going to get wider and wider, which is fine because the rich are supposed to get rich and the poor are supposed to get poor, which is there in history, which is fine. But because you said the banks did a con job in 2008, what I would like to understand is, have we noticed that there were certain people who started shorting the market way before March 2020? And it's the poor people who started buying into the market before March 2020. And post-March 2020, it is the poor people who started selling at a loss as the rich people who started buying at a bottom price. And today, they have doubled or tripled their money.
Okay, so first of all, just to be clear, when I was talking about banks as a con job, I was using, I think the economists in the room will know, the technical term of the fact that banks actually don't have the money to pay you back, right? That's just the basic bit. So that there is fractional banking. So you can't. If we all went and asked for our money from Barclays, they couldn't pay us, right? So it's not that there was any specific con around 2008, although there were lots of other things that were going wrong about taking on risky assets and all the rest of it. So just to be clear on that. Your other point was about the inequality, and it certainly has, this virus has created exactly the sorts of things you're talking about, has increased inequalities in all sorts of quite stark ways. And I think we need to be thinking as a society about how we respond to that. I think there were some areas which we can really learn from, and I'm chairing a commission on civil society which is looking into this, about some of the things, some of the positives, that communities came together in a way that local authorities and governments weren't very good at. And I think there's a lesson here for test and trace and all the rest of it. some of the centralized programs were pretty disastrous, right? Some of the very local stuff, how do you sort out who in your street really needs help? People in the street know that. And if you can give some power to them, some authority, then you help the poor. The point about the markets, as you said, there were clearly some people who were realizing where this went in terms of, you talked about the medical problems, and as soon as you get to a world where you haven't got a vaccine or treatments yet, you move to lockdowns. Lockdowns have dramatic economic impacts, and that means big market movements. And if someone gets ahead and sees that and can exploit that, you can make a huge amount of money. And a lot of people did. So, but yeah, I think fundamentally we need to be thinking about removing those inequalities from society. And the one thing I'll give to you, and I think about this in terms of people's overall well-being, we measure that now, and you can look at, if you take the 10 best countries in the world on people who are most satisfied with their lives, right, and you look at those 10 countries, and then you look at the 10 most democratic countries in the world, it turns out that 7 of them are the same, and they're all small Scandinavian, nearly all small Scandinavian countries. And that's something about a model which actually looks at high tax, high spend. And Australia, and New Zealand, I should add in, and Iceland. But those are the kind of countries we're talking about.
One last question. I think someone's lined up with the microphone already, please.
Conscious of the comments that have been made here today about the problems of incomplete data, the fact that things like lockdown can have really unintended consequences across broad segments of society, and especially conscious of the fact that we don't necessarily elect politicians to make these decisions, why should we give politicians decision-making power? Specifically, why would it be worse to have a crisis jury, for instance, or a citizens' council of several hundred people who are truly representative demographically of the population that makes these kinds of tough decisions without worrying about elections or their peers or their immediate social circle, what have you?
3 minutes.
So, very interesting, your comments about this. So, for example, if you really want the people to have their say, okay, we'll have a referendum. That doesn't work so well, does it? And you have months and months to give people the pros and cons there. The citizens' jury thing, I think the problem with that would be you're dealing with lots of uncertainty. How quickly, you want an answer. You want an answer incredibly quickly, quite often. We were talking about the circuit breaker and how actually desperately all the evidence suggested that should come into place quite quickly. And I would worry if the experts were telling you that's what we really want, and they said, well, we're just going to test it out in a citizens' jury. And, I'm not sure that it's a practical answer. I do think there's massively things wrong with that, the current democracy that we have. When I talked about those 7 out of 10 countries in their democratic thing, you probably thought the UK was in there. It wasn't in either list, nor was the US, right? They are not very good democracies, nor are they actually making their citizens very happy. So there are things we should do to improve our democracy. I quite like the idea of citizens' juries and all the rest of it, whether they're appropriate for this. One of the ways you can take decisions away from politicians, if you think they're sort of technocratic, I helped introduce, which was to make the Bank of England independent, so the Chancellor can't just decide that actually there's an election coming up, so I'm going to cut interest rates and everyone's mortgage bills is going to go down. Hooray! Which, when you looked at the analysis, was the kind of thing that happened. So getting technocrats there, but I think what you need and what we did there was to balance the democratic aspect, that the Bank of England was given a mandate set by democratically elected politicians to deliver inflation at the target specified by the government. If you can generate an outcome like that, a clear target, and then say, right, you experts get on and sort out what it is you have to do to deliver that, and I'll be accountable in Parliament for that part, but you're accountable for the things you did to deliver that target. I'm accountable for the nature of the target. If you can find that divide, then you can do it. And that's an interesting question as to, can we find that divide in more areas? I think part of the problem is a lot of people have moved to wanting to say, let the technocrats run things. And I think that in its own, you know, Mario Monti in Italy, it doesn't work well always. And that's fundamentally, there are some, you know, I'm in the democracy's pretty rubbishy, but I can't think of anything better kind of camp.
Brilliant, thank you, and spot on time. So we need to draw this to a close. Thank you all so much. For those of you online, thank you very much for your attention and for the questions that you sent to us. We're going to send a short questionnaire. Please, if you would fill it in, that would be absolutely wonderful. For those of you here with us in the Shard, thank you very much indeed. Nicole is going to hang around at the end for any questions or comments that you in particular want to ask. Really grateful for your participation. And can we end by saying thank you to our wonderful panellists, Nick Chater, Mike Tilsley, Nicole Robb, and of course, Lord Gus O'Donnell. Thank you all.